Jasmine Crockett accidentally revealed the real reason she's leading the polls. And did she just publicly signal that her opponents aren't ready for a statewide fight? Before we unpack the moment when Jasmine Crockett's recent interview became a coded message about Texas Democrats' internal divisions, make sure you hit that subscribe button because this story reveals why leading in the polls is only half the battle and why she's questioning whether anyone else can actually win. The interview was supposed to be straightforward. A rising political star discussing her potential Senate run, her polling numbers, and her vision for Texas. The kind of conversation that happens dozens of times during election cycles when candidates are testing the waters and building narratives. But about 12 minutes into the interview, something shifted. The language became more pointed, the pauses more deliberate, and anyone paying close attention realized they weren't just hearing a candidate talk about her own campaign. They were hearing a challenge being issued to everyone else in the race. The host had just mentioned the latest polling showing Crockett at 31% comfortably ahead of the pack in the Democratic primary field. State Representative James Tellerico was second at 25%. Former Congressman Beto O'Rourke, who hadn't officially declared, but whose name recognition kept him in discussions, was polling at 18% among likely voters. The numbers were clear. Crockett was the front-runner. But instead of simply acknowledging that position with the usual humility and gratitude, she did something unexpected. She questioned whether the numbers even mattered if the fundamentals weren't in place. "Look, the numbers are the numbers," she started, her tone suggesting that what she was about to say next would qualify that statement significantly. "And I appreciate that voters are responding to my message and my record. But here's what concerns me as I'm thinking about this race. Some people in Democratic politics don't actually believe Texas is winnable. They say they do. They'll go on TV and talk about Texas being a battleground. But when it comes to the actual work, the coalition building, the fundraising infrastructure, the execution, you can tell who really believes and who's just going through the motions." The host asked her to clarify what she meant. Crockett's response was carefully worded, but unmistakably pointed. "What I mean is that winning statewide in Texas requires specific things. It requires someone who can build a coalition that includes black voters, brown voters, young voters, suburban women, the coalition that actually won on November 4th in districts across the state. It requires someone who can raise the kind of money you need for a state as big as Texas. And it requires someone who knows how to execute a campaign at scale, not just talk about it." She paused, letting those criteria hang in the air. Anyone familiar with the Democratic field would immediately start doing the calculation. Who among the candidates actually met all those requirements? Crockett was implying she did. The unspoken question was whether anyone else could say the same. The interview continued, but that theme, readiness, execution, belief, kept surfacing in her answers. When asked about her strengths as a candidate, she didn't just list her legislative accomplishments or her media presence. She talked about data. "The data shows I'm the leading candidate among black and brown voters. That's not opinion. That's measurable. And in a state where the path to Democratic victory runs directly through those communities, that's not a small thing. That's the whole thing." It was a subtle but clear shot at anyone in the race whose support was concentrated among white progressives or whose name recognition came primarily from statewide losses rather than wins. She wasn't naming names, but the implication was impossible to miss. Some candidates had following among activists and political insiders, but she had the coalition that actually decided elections. Then came what political observers would later identify as the most revealing moment of the entire interview. The host asked whether Crockett was concerned about being in a crowded primary field. Her answer started conventionally enough. "Primaries are healthy. Competition is good for democracy." All the usual platitudes. But then she added something that made several political operatives immediately start texting each other. "What I will say is this. We need a strong slate up and down the ballot. We need candidates who can execute because here's the reality. Donald Trump is going to do everything he can at the border on day one. He's not a normal opponent. His anti-immigrant agenda will hit Texas first and hit Texas hardest. And we need Democrats who are ready for that fight, who have thought through the strategy, who aren't just reacting, but are prepared. Some campaigns are ready for that level of intensity. Some aren't. The some aren't landed like a challenge. She was drawing a line between candidates who were serious and candidates who were just occupying space in the race. And while she didn't specify which category anyone fell into, the implication was clear. She considered herself in the first category. And she had doubts about everyone else. Political Twitter exploded almost immediately. Democratic operatives and activists started parsing every word trying to figure out who exactly Crockett was targeting. Was it Terrio, whose progressive credentials were strong, but whose statewide organizational capacity was untested? Was it the perpetual speculation about Beto running again despite his track record of narrow losses? Was it other potential candidates who'd been making noises about entering the race, but hadn't committed? The truth, as careful observers noted, was probably all of them. Crockett wasn't taking shots at one specific opponent. She was issuing a blanket challenge to the entire field. Prove you can do this. Prove you have what it takes. Prove you're not just running because you think it's your turn or because donors convinced you to or because you want the platform. Prove you can actually win. Behind the scenes, according to multiple sources who spoke to Texas political reporters, the interview caused immediate tension within Democratic circles. James Terrico's campaign, which had been carefully positioning him as the progressive voice in the race with deep legislative experience, suddenly found itself needing to respond to questions about organizational capacity and coalition building. Could he raise the tens of millions needed for a statewide race? Could he win over black voters in Houston and Dallas? Could he compete in the Rio Grande Valley? These were questions his campaign had been planning to address eventually, but Crockett had just forced them to the forefront. Carrico's response when it came during his own interview a few days later was diplomatic, but clearly defensive. I have deep respect for Representative Crockett and for everyone in this race. I think Texas Democrats are fortunate to have multiple strong candidates. As for execution and coalition building, my record speaks for itself. I've built relationships across the state. I've fought for working families in the legislature. And I'm confident in our campaign's ability to compete everywhere. It was a perfectly reasonable statement that nonetheless had the feel of someone responding to a challenge rather than confidently asserting their own narrative. But the most interesting response came from sources close to Beto, who'd been privately meeting with donors and activists about a potential Senate run despite his public ambiguity about entering the race. According to two people familiar with the discussions, Crockett's interview caused immediate concern within that circle. She basically laid out all the reasons Beto shouldn't run without ever saying his name. One source told a Texas Tribune reporter, the comment about needing someone who can win, not just someone with name recognition from previous losses, that was aimed directly at the Beto speculation. And it was effective because it's true. He's run statewide twice and lost both times. Why would this time be different? The concern was significant enough, but Ur's timeline for making a decision reportedly accelerated. If he was going to enter the race, he'd need to do it soon and with a compelling answer to Crockett's implicit challenge. What's different this time? Why should voters believe you can win when you couldn't before? Crockett's campaign, meanwhile, leaned into the message she delivered in the interview. Within 48 hours, they'd released new data showing her favorable ratings among black voters in major Texas cities, her fundraising totals from small donors, and endorsements from local officials in key counties. It was a coordinated follow-up designed to substantiate every claim she'd made. Yes, she had the coalition. Yes, she could raise money. Yes, she could execute. The question wasn't whether she could do these things. It was whether anyone else could. The strategic brilliance of Crockett's approach became clearer over the following week. She'd managed to position herself as the front-runner without appearing arrogant, questioned her opponent's readiness without attacking them directly, and forced the entire Democratic field to respond to her framing of what the race required. She'd set the terms of the debate, and everyone else was now operating within the framework she'd established. But there was another layer to her message that political analysts noted. The repeated emphasis on Trump and what he would do on day one. This wasn't just about the Democratic primary. Crockett was already thinking ahead to the general election, already framing the race as an urgent response to specific threats that required specific preparedness by constantly bringing the conversation back to Trump's border policies and their impact on Texas. She was implicitly arguing that the Democratic nominee couldn't just be someone who excited progressives or had strong legislative credentials. It had to be someone who could go toe-to-toe with Trump's agenda in the state where that agenda would be most aggressively implemented. It was a subtle repositioning of what Democratic primary voters should be looking for. Not just the most progressive candidate, not just the one with the best legislative record, not just the one with name recognition, but the one who was ready for the specific fight that Texas Democrats would face in 2026. And Crockett was making the case that she was that candidate while raising doubts about whether anyone else was. The interview also revealed something about Crockett's political instincts that had impressed observers throughout her congressional career. She understood that leading in the polls wasn't enough. She needed to define why she was leading and what that leadership meant for the race. By publicly questioning whether other candidates had the fundamentals to win, she was preemptively addressing the inevitable narrative that would emerge if the race tightened. Was she really the strongest candidate or just the one benefiting from early name recognition? Her answer to that unasked question was clear. Look at the coalition. Look at the fundraising. Look at the execution capacity. Look at the readiness for what Trump is going to do. Those are the metrics that matter. And by those metrics, she wasn't just ahead. She was the only candidate who checked all the boxes. The tension within Texas Democratic politics that Crockett's interview exposed wasn't new, but it had been largely kept beneath the surface until now. There had always been questions about whether the party was truly committed to competing statewide or whether recent close races had created a false sense of inevitability. There had always been concerns about whether candidates who performed well in progressive enclaves could build the broader coalition needed to actually win. There had always been debate about the right balance between ideological purity and pragmatic electability. Crockett had brought all of those tensions into the open, not through explicit criticism, but through pointed questions about fundamentals. And in doing so, she'd shifted the burden of proof. It was no longer enough for other candidates to simply declare their candidacy and assume voters would evaluate them fairly. They now needed to answer Crockett's implicit challenge. Prove you're ready for this. Prove you can build the coalition. Prove you can raise the money. Prove you can execute at scale. Prove you actually believe Texas is winnable and have a plan to win it. In a follow-up statement released several days after the interview, Crockett addressed the attention her comments had generated. I've been heartened by the response from voters and activists across Texas who share my sense of urgency about this race. We're not just running against a Republican opponent. We're running against time to build the infrastructure and coalition we need before Trump's policies devastate communities across our state. I'm confident in my ability to lead that fight. I hope everyone in this race is asking themselves the same hard questions about readiness and capacity that I'm asking, because Texas Democrats and Texas families deserve candidates who are prepared for the challenge ahead. It was classic Crockett, respectful in tone, devastating in substance. She'd managed to position her rivals' silence or defensive responses as evidence that maybe they hadn't thought through the hard questions she was raising. And she'd done it all while maintaining the posture of someone focused on the real fight against Republicans rather than internal Democratic politics. Political strategists from both parties took note. Republicans who'd been preparing for various potential Democratic nominees suddenly had to recalibrate their opposition research and attack strategies. If Crockett was indeed going to be the nominee, and the polling combined with her political positioning suggested that was increasingly likely, they'd be facing a candidate who was already thinking several moves ahead, who was addressing weaknesses before they could be exploited, and who had a clear-eyed understanding of what the race would require. One Republican strategist told a reporter with a mix of respect and concern, "She's running the general election campaign already, and the primary isn't even set yet." That's smart, but it's also dangerous for us because she's not going to make the mistakes other Democrats have made of winning the primary by moving too far left and then struggling to pivot back to center. She's building a coalition strategy from day one. That's the mark of someone who's actually studied what it takes to win in Texas. As the interview's impact continued to ripple through Texas politics, one thing became increasingly clear. Jasmine Crockett had done more than just reaffirm her position as the frontrunner. She'd redefined what the race was about, raised the bar for what Democratic voters should expect from candidates, and forced every opponent to answer fundamental questions about their readiness. Whether that translated into an actual victory remained to be seen, but she'd done what any skilled politician must do. She'd seized control of the narrative at exactly the moment when that control mattered most. In her closing comments during the MS Now interview, Crockett had said something that would become the defining quote from the entire conversation. "I'm closer to yes than no on this race. But I'm not running just to run. I'm running to win. And I think Texas Democrats are tired of moral victories. We want actual victories. We need candidates who understand the difference." It was a statement of intent, a challenge to opponents, and a promise to voters all wrapped into one. And judging by the reaction it generated, Texas Democrats had heard the message loud and clear. If this breakdown of how Jasmine Crockett used one interview to reshape the entire Texas Senate race showed you why political positioning matters as much as polling numbers, hit that like button and subscribe for more analysis of the strategic moments that define campaigns before votes are even cast. Drop a comment telling us whether you think questioning opponents' readiness is smart politics or risky strategy. And share this with anyone who wants to understand how candidates jockey for position in high-stakes races. Your engagement helps us keep covering the political chess moves that happen long before Election Day.